Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College coming to you with another video for lifespan human development. This time we'll be looking at things that are in chapter 3 of your textbook, focusing on the first 2 years and development of body and mind. So let me get myself out of the picture and let me get a pointer here so that I can show you where I'm at there, or where I am, I guess is correct speech. Okay, so here we go. The first 2 years of development shows rapid physical growth and most of all, development of the brain. And as you can see, the child's brain weight will reach 75% of their adult brain weight within that first couple years, whereas their height's only 50% and their weight less than 25%. So you might say development in some ways is most rapid in the brain. So the brain is part of our nervous system, and this contains very important cells that we refer to as neurons that transmit and process information. We have billions of these present at birth. And these are present in especially great numbers in the brain's cortex, its outer layer that is responsible for our ability to think, sense our outside environment, to interpret information, perceive, and higher mental processes such as memory and so forth. So having a look at those neurons, then there are a number of important structures that are part of them. We have the dendrite. The dendrite is this bushy branching structure, many of them on each neuron. And these dendrites then receive messages from other cells, from our sensory receptors or from other neurons. These dendrites then, as the child matures, will begin branching out to make new connections. So that's part of the process that the brain begins to use to wire itself up. Then we also have this axon, this longer cable-like structure, and this can conduct messages called neural impulses, which eventually reach these terminal buds here. And this then stimulates the release of chemicals called neurotransmitters into this synapse. The synapse is a connecting point between a neuron and another cell, whether that be a muscle cell, whether that be another neuron. So these neurotransmitters then bind up with specific receptor sites on other cells in order to influence them. Neurotransmitters then may stimulate other neurons, causing them to become more active, or they may inhibit the activity of other neurons. Now, as these neurons then begin to fire together through this mechanism, then we have the development also of neural networks, series of neurons that activate together to accomplish various tasks. And the way that works is each time one of these neurons influences the other, it begins to wire the other together into that neural network. And for example, when babies are first born, you'll notice that their movements are just kind of seem to be mostly random, other than reflexes, and totally uncoordinated. And that's because these neural networks for various motor skills have not yet wired themselves up. So as the baby is just somehow getting some random neural activity there that stimulates various movements. And when that movement is one that's desirable, then that is repeated, and you'll see babies doing that, repeating over and over again some movement. And that then enables that neural network for that particular motor skill to wire up so that they eventually have voluntary control over that movement. So notice that the interaction between these genetically determined neurons and their environment and their experience is very important. It's not just nature, it's not just nurture, they're working together. And then you see the growth and refinement of these neural networks as genes and experience interact. For example, in the development of facial recognition. So there are areas of the visual cortex that must wire up in order to register the visual image of a face. And then there are also areas in a facial recognition area, frontal cortex, that also must wire up. And so what you find is very young babies, at first, anything that resembles a face will produce a positive response on their part, whether it be a human, animal, or even just a smiley face on a piece of paper. It makes them no difference. Then a little bit later, as they begin to have more experience and develop these networks more fully, they respond particularly in a positive way to human faces as opposed to animal faces or pieces of paper. And then with even more time, they respond most positively to those that they have close relationships, like their mother, father, family members, and so forth. So they've learned to recognize specific individuals amongst humans. So all of this requires both experience as well as the maturation of those neural networks. So we also will find that the development of the brain is uneven. So when the child is born, the cortex is not equally wired up. What you'll find is the auditory cortex is quite well developed. And this is because the baby has been exposed to sounds prenatally throughout their development. And so these areas can begin already wiring up. On the other hand, the visual cortex is least mature at birth because there's nothing to see there. So without any visual stimulation, these neural networks don't form yet. The frontal cortex, this area of the brain here, where many of our higher cognitive skills are conducted, things like planning, self-control, self-regulation, very immature in the newborn. Well, that might account why they're not very good at planning or controlling themselves or regulating their behavior, right? This is not well developed yet. So what we also find is that this development of these neural networks involves the uh, formation of new synapses and dendritic branching and dendrite formation that increases initially, and then unused synapses, dendrites, eventually are pruned away. So it's almost like, those that don't end up being used in those neural networks, many of them will dissipate because they're sort of just extra pathways that make the brain actually less efficient. And so we'll see, again, differential time frame on this for different abilities. In the chart, you'll see that for the sensory abilities like vision, hearing, you'll find that synaptic formation, dendritic branching, very rapid, very early, first couple months. And then the pruning process begins to trim back some of those extra synapses, dendrites. On the other hand, receptive language areas that are involved with understanding language and eventually also productive speech areas as well for producing language, those come in a bit later and again proliferate and then are pruned, excess is pruned away, which accounts for why kids can see and hear before they can understand language or speak. And then for higher cognitive functions, that follows even later. So the ability, memory ability, or the ability to understand more complex things. So we have some differential time frames with these things. Next, let's look at the importance of stimulation for normal development at this point in development. So we first began learning about this through rat studies. And scientists studied the effects of good rat mothering versus bad mothering, learned a lot from this. Now, you might say, well, what's a good rat mother do? Well, good rat mothers, the thing that they do is they lick their rat pups, they groom them. And turns out that's very important. In these studies, they found rats that had good mothering, that were licked and groomed by their mothers, ended up as adult rats who had relatively low stress hormones, relatively low anxiety, and were capable of becoming good rat mothers if they were female as well. On the other hand, rats who did not get this as pups, their mothers did not groom them, lick them, the opposite was true. They found as adults, they exhibited high levels of stress hormones. They produced greater fear and anxiety responses, and they were incapable of good mothering. They subsequently also found out that this had to do, at least in part, with the methylation of a specific gene that is involved with transporting the neurotransmitter serotonin within the brain. Serotonin, known in humans to have influence on mood, as well as ability to tolerate stress and ability to um, uh, not produce undue anxiety responses and fear responses. So in humans, the quality of mothering at this point is also significant for the same reasons. Now, you think about what is good human mothering at this point. Well, maybe not so much licking the babies like rats do, but definitely caring for them, one-on-one interaction with them, playing with them, communicating with them, um, exhibiting emotional expressions that the baby can see. So all of that kind of interaction, as well as physical play with them, touch, so forth, very important. All of that stimulation. So playing with babies, also allowing them new experience, stimulating to their brain development, encouraging them to engage in safe movement. All of these stimulate brain development in humans. On the other hand, lack of normal stimulation stunts brain growth, as we'll see in the next slide. So just to kind of check your understanding of that. So according to what we just saw, do babies need special toys, special programs to learn for normal brain development? Well, the answer is no. They need simply just a what? Normal environment where people play with them, interact with them. They get a chance to experience new things frequently, and that they get the opportunity to move around. So nothing real special is needed, but yes, you do need that interaction. So social deprivation. being isolated from others then interferes with brain development. Again, we first began learning about this in rat studies like those of Diamond and Greenow, and they did situations where they had two groups of rat pups, and one group of rats was raised in isolation. They had no other rats at all to interact with. The second group of rats had many rat pups that they could interact with. The end result, the rats raised in isolation, they found their brains to be less developed. There were fewer connections in those brains. The brains were less dense than those that had opportunity to interact with others. And so we can see social deficit where one has not had the opportunity to interact with other actually interferes with brain development. Now, this obviously is not the kind of experiment that you can do with humans, but we can observe where it's sad to say something like this kind has occurred to some children. And this occurred back when communism came down in Eastern Europe, and in Romania, they found some orphanages run by the communists there where children were kept. And these children were victims of severe social deprivation. They were did not have any interactions with others. There were no one played with them. In fact, they were kept in cribs all day with nowhere to go. They couldn't even really see the other children that were in there. Someone simply came and gave them food and water daily, and that was it. What they found with these children, obviously, they removed them from that situation immediately and brought and put them into foster families that could take care of them and give them a normal environment. They did find, even though these children were very much behind in their cognitive development, social development, they didn't know how to interact with others. Their intellectual abilities were very much undeveloped. But what they saw is a great deal of catch-up growth, and this goes along with our textbook's comments that humans tend to be self-righting. In other words, if we have some sort of setback, given the right conditions, we can right ourselves and get back on the track of development. Um, but what they did see is emotional damage. These children often would exhibit unexplained fear and anger. They didn't know how to also interact with others. For example, rather than being somewhat wary of strangers, they were often over friendly to strangers. So by the time these children reached age 11, what they found, if they were adopted before age 6 months, they pretty much normalized in terms of intellectual development, social development, and so forth. However, if they were over a year at adoption, they continued to be 15 points lower on average on intelligence scores and had deficits in terms of social interactions with others and ability to control uh, their emotions and to control their impulses and urges to act. So, yeah, this is something that there is some resilience to if it's caught very early on, but obviously there's not much time. So, what they also found is that obviously the kids that were in these institutions were doing worse. Kids that were in foster homes such as this do better. Kids that were raised by their own families, obviously, even better than that. But I think this should highlight that all children need love and stimulation, interactions with others, both their age as well as interactions with adults. Very important for normal brain development, emotional development, social development. Shaken baby syndrome is one of the things that is damaging to brain development. And this is where someone takes a child and shakes them so violently that actually there will be rupture of blood vessels within their brain. And so the end result with these children can be intellectual deficits, problems with controlling attention and hyperactivity. Um, these children may become completely passive and show no emotional response as well as motivation to engage in behaviors on their own behalf. So it can be very, very similar, very, very serious. Now, by the way, I should ask you the question, and I'm sure you're thinking about this. You're thinking, how can anybody ever do such a thing? And at first you think, well, these must be really bad people, just bad people. But in fact, some people that have engaged in this action are, other than doing this, haven't done such terrible things. How does this tend to happen? Well, the most common scenario is this happens amongst with a caregiver for the child that is isolated. So that caregiver, whether it's a mother, whether this is someone else who is babysitting the child, has no one to help them with the child. The child, may be crying constantly, and finally that person snaps and they do this. So one of the things that we can do to prevent this is to prevent um, caregivers of young children from being isolated so that there's others to step in when they're getting frustrated. Now, I should say there's a couple secondary things that frequently do play a part. Sometimes there is some mental disorder, and sometimes there's a substance abuse problem that contributes. But very often, happens even outside of that. Okay. Now, other things that are damaging to brain development would be other types of abuse. Okay, so whether that's neglect or whether that is emotional abuse, physical abuse, any of these types of abuse. And what we see happening in these children is they develop extremely high levels of cortisol and other stress hormones, which interfere with brain development and interfere with brain function. And so again, this creates a situation of brain is not functioning as it should. So in children who experience abuse, you may see hypervigilance where even the slightest movement is startles them, or you may see flat affect. The child simply doesn't respond to things emotionally as normal children would. Also, children who are abused often have difficulty bonding, obviously, with caregivers who abuse them, but even with others that are safe and do care for them well. Also, difficulty in social interaction as well is common amongst children who are abused, and interacting appropriately with other children or adults. Maybe here's something where I want to just point out something which I will repeat several times throughout the course. So, what if you suspect that some abuse is occurring? What should you do? Okay. Well, here in Texas, all of us, no matter who we are obligated by law to report suspicion of abuse. So if there's anything that suggests abuse is going on, gives us reasonable suspicion, we need to report that. Now, there are numerous ways to report that. Okay, obviously, if the abuse is occurring right this moment, the answer is three numbers, 911, and immediately get help with that. If it is, though, something that is not going on at this particular moment, but we believe it is occurring, then we might make a call to the police department on a non-emergency line. We might call Child Protective Services and report it through them. Or we can go to the Texas Abuse Hotline. So all you have to do is pull up your good friend Google or any other browser and type in Texas Abuse Hotline, and you can report that. You can report it anonymously if you choose, so that no one can connect you with investigations that will follow. Okay, so the important thing is to make a report of that abuse if you know it's occurred or if you have reasonable suspicion. Do it. It can make all the difference for a child. Okay, so how do we study brain development and brain function? Well, neuroscientists have numerous tools. One would be the EEG. So the electroencephalogram is a thing that it picks up various brain waves of all kinds of types that wave activity that the brain produces through means of electrodes placed on the scalp. Like you can see, this little cap here will contain those electrodes that can detect that brain activity. And so we may be able to learn some things regarding where certain things are occurring and certain mental states associated with certain event-related potentials, specific types of electrical activity or brain waves, looking at babies. The MRI is a tool that neuroscience uses terrifically. It gives us a very clear picture of the brain structure, and the functional MRI is something that also can show us the activity of the brain as well, and even changes in brain activity over very short periods of time. Now, the one problem about studying brain activity in very young babies is that, well, they don't hold still very long, and you've got to have them hold still for a considerable period of time for an MRI. So in terms of doing research, not so easy to do using the MRI with babies. Adults were more successful. The PET scan. This is a test that can be done where they inject a slightly radioactive form of glucose into the bloodstream. It's about like getting an X-ray or two. And then we can track where the brain is utilizing that. That indicates where the brain has been most active. Once again, here's one that we don't particularly use to study brain activity in babies because it does expose them to some radioactivity. That said, if there is a neurological problem, then the PET scan might be used to detect just what's going on, what's wrong with that child's brain in that case. Okay, so it might be very important to detect what's happening there. So basically, I think one of the things we can say is that it's not really easy to study brain activity in very young babies like this. Yeah, it's going to be a challenge, neuroscientists, to develop methods that are harmless, easy to use. That said, there are many other tools that you'll see that we have developed that can help us get some idea of what's going on inside of there. So let's have a look next at the development of sleep patterns within the first 2 years. So newborn babies average about 17 hours of sleep a day, various levels of sleep, kind of in 1 to 3 hour segments. Most of that sleep is, active sleep where they don't seem to be fully asleep, kind of in the twilight between awake and asleep in many cases. And they also spend a great deal of time in REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. If you've taken general psychology, you should know that, oh, REM sleep, yeah, that's when they wake people up in REM sleep, they report that they were having dreams. And so we have every reason to believe that babies also are experiencing dreams when they're in REM sleep. This may be one of the ways that the brain is providing stimulation for development of those neural networks that we talked about. So even when the baby is sleeping, there is neural stimulation occurring through that REM sleep. Um, Quiet sleep, that deep sleep where brain waves and slow down and breathing slows, there is not so much of that. But what we'll find is the proportions of these things changes over time. In a few months, the amount of quiet sleep increases while the amount of REM sleep begins to decrease. And the baby also spends less time in transition between wake and sleep, more time alert as well as time passes. By the time they reach their first birthday, often they're down to 2 naps a day or so and sleeping longer at night. And for some kids, maybe sleeping through the night, even without waking up by that time. So a great deal of progression there. So next we go to the development of sensation and perception, which we touched on just a hair at the beginning. So sensation is the ability to detect various stimuli in our environment. So through vision, we detect light particles, hearing sound waves, touch, pressure on our skin, and so forth. So sensation is simply raw information, not interpreted yet. Perception is the processing of sensory information. So it's trying to figure out just what is that pattern of sound waves? What does that represent? Is that a dog barking, or is that a bird chirping, or is that my mother calling me? What does it mean? That's part of perception too. So this is the processing of that information. Might just mention, of the two, sensation is the easier process. Yeah, it hasn't been hard to even develop mechanical devices that can engage in sensation. We have cameras and microphones that can, detect sounds and, you know, light particles, right? But to develop mechanical devices capable of perception, that's a lot bigger problem. As they were trying to develop intelligent robots, boy, that was what really set them back, because, yeah, the robots could detect the sound waves, the light particles, but they didn't know what to do with that information. They couldn't interpret it. And so that whole business of interpreting that information is much more difficult for robots. And for humans, perception also takes a bit more time and effort. So sensory development typically occurs then before perceptual development, as well as before intellectual and motor development. So children can hear sounds before they know what they mean. They can hear words before they know what they mean. So the sense of hearing is the most advanced sense in humans, and they will find certain sounds naturally startling, obviously loud noises, unpleasant sounds, as well as certain sounds to be soothing. The sound of mom's heartbeat, mom's voice, or the sound of calm rhythmic music, so forth. So they are, in fact, attentive most of all to the sounds of human speech. Of any sound, they will pay attention to that before anything else. Now, when encountering human speech, first they begin to identify just the patterns of the rhythm, the inflection, to get a sense of the emotion that's being conveyed even before they know what the words mean. Vision, least mature sense at birth. Newborns only able to actually focus on objects that are somewhere between 4 and 30 inches from their face. Interestingly, that's about the distance that they need to breastfeed effectively. So they're geared for that at first. Uh, Vision for focusing on objects at other distances comes in over time. They're unable to track moving objects at first. In fact, not until they get to around 3 months can they follow a moving object. And they also initially are unable to work their eyes together in a coordinated fashion so that they can have binocular vision and focus both eyes on the same thing. So, very young babies, you'll see, yeah, one eye is going over here and the other eye might be over there. Now, as they then become more mature, eventually they get the ability to focus both eyes on the same thing. So we then can have binocular vision, at which point we can estimate the distance, the depth perception much better. That really comes in around 3 months and also then helps the baby to coordinate movements with things that they're looking at. Um, so what we also know is that the child must have early visual sensation in order to develop full visual perception. What's that mean? They need to have visual input early on for that visual cortex, at the back of their brain, to wire up those neural circuits necessary for visual perception. If they don't have visual input early on, even if we can restore vision to them, they may not be able to, for example, separate objects from the background or to estimate how close something is, that sort of thing. So, very important that if the child has some problem with their vision that's evident early on, that we correct it as early as possible. Smell and taste are well developed in infants. Newborns can actually differentiate their mother's scent from that of others. And this was interesting. They did experiments where babies were presented, newborns were presented with a cloth that was handled by their mother or a cloth that was handled by a stranger. And the newborns did not find the cloth handled by the stranger to be at all comforting, yet they found if their mother had handled that cloth item, that they found it to be comforting. They were able to associate that object in the scent with their mother and her presence. Um, Interestingly, they think that babies also may begin learning an appreciation for various foods through hints of that taste that come through breast milk. So that might be, contribute to the cultural transmission of food preferences that we have. Interesting, I think. And they can begin learning the association between various scents and events that occur. The sensation of touch and pain. Obviously, some physical sensations are soothing, massage, stroking, cuddling. On the other hand, obviously, certain touch sensations are unpleasant. Obviously, uh, babies are very sensitive to temperature variation. And so sometimes I'm not sure why they're unhappy. It may be simply they're not happy with the temperature in the room or whatever. Um, Also, interestingly, they found that placing some sugar on a baby's tongue could sort of be used as a minor anesthetic, which I think is pretty interesting. It sounds to me almost like a distraction, if you will, but they might actually give the child a little bit of something sugary immediately before they give them an immunization or something like that, and it can be kind of helpful. Now, you will read in the textbook about there's some controversy over infant pain, and you have some experts saying that, well, babies don't feel pain. So I found that to be really difficult to understand. But I think I might I might kind of understand what they mean. Okay, obviously, if something happens to a baby that would be painful in an adult, often they will respond by crying. Obviously, they're feeling something very unpleasant. I think the point about infant pain that some of these people are trying to make is they might not experience it like an older child and an adult in terms of the emotional response to what happened to their body. Um, Maybe thinking of kids a little bit older than this might illustrate that. Let's say you've got a kid who's a little bit older, maybe 3, 4 year old, and they're running around, they skin up their knee, and they just get up and they continue going like nothing happened. You've probably seen this. And they're fine until somebody comes along, like let's say mom, and mom sees their knee and they go, "Oh my God, what happened to you?" And then the child starts bawling, oh, and then they're screaming. And yeah, and notice, yeah, they sort of didn't have an emotional response to that physical injury until someone told them that they ought to be scared and they ought to be concerned about it. I think that's what these people that are, talking against infants feeling pain are talking about, that they maybe don't have the emotional response, but certainly physically they're experiencing something very unpleasant when something painful occurs. There's my 2 cents on that. Okay. Um, Moving on to motor development of motor skills. So the baby's first movements are going to be reflexive movements. These are automatic responses that are triggered by specific uh, particular stimuli automatically. They're built in, don't have to be learned. And they can test those reflexes with the Brazel scale. You don't have to memorize that entire name, but Brazelton scale. Um, they notice that um, reflexes that are working properly indicate that the nervous system is also working properly, that is developed normally. And so here are some illustrations of some important um, infant reflexes. Very young babies, if you hold them up and place their feet on a flat surface, they will do a stepping motion. Now, they can't hold themselves up and walk or anything, but you'll see that stepping motion. And by the way, that will dissipate usually after a few months and then return when the baby begins to walk, although that's, some argue, a different motor pathway once they're beginning to walk. Here you see the grasping reflex, and so you put anything in the baby's palm with their hands and they'll grasp it, and they've got a pretty good grip. You can see they can actually be held up by their grip, as you see in the picture. And then here's the sucking reflex. You put anything in their mouth and they will suck on it. Obviously, this is beneficial because this will enable them to feed automatically. So some reflexes that we see then are those that ensure survival. So breathing, thrashing, shivering, the sucking reflex, the rooting reflex, that's where the baby will turn their head towards anything that touches their cheek. That's involved with feeding. Swallowing and spitting up, coughing reflex, those kind of things, sort of survival related. Other reflexes seem to have no particular survival function, but are signs of normal functioning. Often these are present early on and then disappear within the first few months. Things like this Babinski reflex, where you stroke their feet and their toes out, stepping reflex that we mentioned, the swimming reflex, you lay them down on their stomach, kind of do the swimming kind of motions. Palmar grasp, that's the grasping reflex we saw in the picture. Moral reflex, if you startle them, they'll throw their arms out and arch their back, and then they'll bring everything back in together. Um, so I don't know, that one might have survival function maybe, or maybe did it one time. But anyways, notice that it is normal for these things to be present early on and then dissipate. So the first then voluntary movements would be the gross motor skills. And so these would be what, large body movements involving large muscle groups, larger muscles. And these then will develop in a progression. And so you will see, I think this might be out of order. Yeah, yeah, it actually is. Yeah. So you would see babies, what, first crawling, and then they would begin pushing themselves up on things, and then standing while holding on to something, and then finally standing while not holding on to things, then taking a step, falling down, taking a step, falling down, until finally they're able to take some steps without falling, and eventually you have walking. So notice that when it comes to the development of walking, that the progression requires the development of muscle skill, brain maturation, development of those neural networks we talked about, and practice. And so this also involves an environment where you have opportunity to try all this stuff. We'll have a look at the developmental norms here on the chart. Okay, here we go. Now, you can see in the chart, this column here would be average. When 50% of all babies, that would be average time. Okay, so you can see when it comes to walking well, they have here, they've got 13 months. Now, we usually just say, yeah, you can expect walking on average around a year, 12 months, but walking well takes a little bit longer, obviously. So that's average, okay? Takes a little bit longer to walk backwards, jump, run, all that stuff. Here we have in the right column when 95% of all babies, okay? So this is sort of the outside, um, outside quadrant here, not quadrant, but actually last 5 percentiles. So notice that even 95% of babies are walking well by 15 months. So if your baby is not walking at 15 months, should you be concerned? Well, the answer when it comes to walking is probably not yet, unless they're having trouble with some of these other developmental norms here and they're well behind. Probably you're going to be okay at 15 months. Now, if there's other things that they're having trouble with, that would be part of normal development at that point, then you might have more cause for concern. When should we get really concerned? Well, when we get out further and further from this 95th percentile. Now, that said, some normal babies don't walk until even 20 months with some babies, but other than that, they're normal. But generally, we say, well, the more things are having trouble with, and the further it is from that 95th percentile, the greater the cause for concern. So if there is concern with that, then we should have that evaluated by a professional to see whether there's a significant problem. Okay, so that's gross motor development, motor skills. On to fine motor development. So this involves then fine motor skills, more precise bodily movements, especially those that involve the hands and fingers. So a big advance for kids is around a year, they'll develop their pincer grip, where they can actually bring together their thumb and their fingers. And you might think, well, who cares? That's no big deal. But in fact, when you can do that, there's all kinds of things that you can now do that you couldn't do before. You can handle things in a way that weren't possible. And this, though, requires experience and timing. So when they first do this, they're first developing it, they will close their hand too soon, or they will open it too soon, and so they have to practice this, but it's sort of built in that they're going to do that around that time. Now, when they first do this, when they first start getting this pincher grip thing going, At first, it's compulsive. In other words, they don't have voluntary control of it. So if there's something that they could pick up that way, that's in their field of view, they will try to do it at first. You can't control it at first. And so if you punish them harshly for that, that's really inappropriate at that point. Now, by the time they get to around age 2, they should have more voluntary control of that grasp motion such that they don't pick up and handle things that they're not supposed to. So at that point, you can expect them to have more control. Okay. Let's go next to the topic of simply surviving those first couple years in good health. And so, one of the most important things that we can do to help children survive is to give them the appropriate immunizations. Now, just to show you how important this is, uh, immunizations means that in a class of 25, I have 25 students. If there were no immunizations, that class would be only half that many. Yeah, only half that size, because half of those individuals would have died by the time they got to college age due to infectious diseases that have been prevented now through immunizations. Immunizations are extremely important, and even if some others are not getting immunizations, if enough people immunize their children within a population, it's enough to keep outbreaks from some of these horrific diseases from happening. But if enough people refuse to immunize their child, then we will see outbreaks of some of these things. And just to give you some better understanding about that, there have been many people who uh, talk about perceived harm that immunizations that are commonly given can do. There's been a tremendous rumor around that immunizations cause autism. In fact, that's completely false. Um, that is a rumor that was started by two researchers that falsified the results of their research, began that rumor, and one of them, a medical doctor, has lost their medical license for falsifying that research. The other researcher also unable to practice as a researcher anymore. Nonetheless, there are still people that repeat this over and over, even though there is tremendous evidence to the contrary. They've done many studies, and they've found over and over again, studying thousands and even hundreds of thousands of children, that children who receive immunizations are no more likely to develop autism than children that we withhold them from, that their parents withhold them from. So just don't believe that stuff. Okay. Now, are there risks with immunizations? Yes. And yes, there can be some negative responses. But if you look closely at the chart here and you look at the potential risks, usually the risks of the immunization are very mild consequences. And where there are more serious consequences listed, they are very rare. And in fact, often the effect of the disease will produce, yeah, many more common and more serious things, way more serious, way more likely to cause the actual illness, more likely to cause things like death or, blindness or mental retardation, things like that. So when you weigh the risks versus the benefits, you will find, yes, these immunizations that we commonly use, the benefits much greater than risks that are typically encountered. So take that to heart, okay? And right now we're in the COVID coronavirus pandemic going on. Hopefully we will have an immunization for that before long. because it doesn't seem to hit kids as seriously, but yet that's circulating around. Hopefully, we'll get, once those immunizations are developed, we'll be able to get people to actually take them. Anyways, I diverge here, so let me get back to the topic. So, second thing, beyond immunizations, would be preventing SIDS. SIDS is sudden infant death syndrome. One of the things they found that we can do increases or decreases the likelihood. Oh, didn't mention this, explained it earlier, but sudden infant death syndrome, the baby simply stops breathing after being laid down to sleep, and they can die from that. We don't exactly know what causes it in every case and so on. Nonetheless, happens. But what they found is if we lay babies down on their back rather than other positions, they are much less likely to suffer from SIDS. So that's important. Now, some people have concerns about co-sleeping with infants, and they may wonder if that increases the likelihood of SIDS or some other terrible thing happening to the child. Studies of this indicated doesn't seem to be a problem. The only times where this does seem to be risky is where we have a mother who is under the influence of mind-altering drugs, that sort of thing, where they might inadvertently roll over that child and not be aware of it, something like that. But other than that, there seems to be no risk to co-sleeping with babies. Okay. When it comes to nutrition for human babies, the best nutrition is breastfeeding human milk, and it is geared specifically for the needs of humans. Um, Breastfeeding also provides many benefits for babies. It provides antibodies to help fight off illnesses. Babies who receive breastfeeding, less likely to develop allergies, asthma, less likely to become obese. They find also that babies breastfed on average scored a few points higher on intelligence tests, not a lot, but a little bit. Just a whole bunch of very beneficial effects of breastfeeding. Also, for mothers, there are benefits in terms of resistance to breast cancer if they breastfeed, less likely to develop that, losing extra weight that they had from their pregnancy also. And simply maybe convenience. It's a lot easier, moms say, to breastfeed when the baby needs to be fed during the night than to get up and prepare a bottle with formula and so forth. So this is, wherever possible, the best nutrition for infants. Obviously, also malnutrition must be avoided because this is going to impact brain development and leave the infant also more susceptible to disease. So there you go. We'll stop here to avoid making it too long, and we'll pick up the remainder, which will involve cognitive development in the first 2 years on our next video. So have a great day and talk to you later.